Welcome to the Cibola County Historical Society's Airways Heritage Museum. I am Steve Owen. I'm one of the volunteers on the committee, and would like to give you an overview of the history that we are trying to preserve here and what we have accomplished so far with the museum development. This is an airway history museum from the 1920s up until the 1960s, basically. And we're focusing on the lighted airway that crossed western New Mexico here. We have a group of volunteers that give tours on Saturday mornings. We're normally open 9 to 1, and perhaps we will get a few more volunteers and be open another day. But this is our recreation of both a rural beacon site from the Mid-Continental Airport, and secondly, the flight service station that the Federal Aviation Administration operated here for 20 years between 1953 and 1973. One of the primary reasons for the idea of a museum in this area at all has to do with the tragic crash of a Ford trimotor airliner in 1929. Sadly, the airline, Transcontinental Air Transport, had only been in service for 2 months when a plane westbound out of Albuquerque came to a disastrous end on the slopes of Mount Taylor. There was a vicious summer monsoon thunderstorm, and the airplane disappeared from sight, and there were no radio transmissions. The plane just disappeared, and it was several days before another competing airline spotted the wreckage on the slope of Mount Taylor. So what we have here are the names of the passengers and crew of this first major air disaster in the state of New Mexico, and actually along this airway corridor. The passengers were 5, 1 woman and 4 men, and then there was a crew of 3 on the aircraft. So they disappeared after leaving Albuquerque, and as I mentioned, it was 3 or 4 days before there was any resolution of how far they had gone and what may have become of the airplane. It was a Ford trimotor of Transcontinental Air Transport, and one of the most significant people on board was a local or a regional lumbering industrialist who ran the logging business for many years in the Zuni Mountains, and he was taking his first flight from Albuquerque to Los Angeles. Sadly, his businesses pretty much faded away after his death. It wasn't possible to keep that part of the economy going. So this is a stylized propeller from the Ford trimotor, and the plaque with the names of the victims, of course, and the circumstances. We surveyed this site as Forest Service volunteers in 2009. However, the Forest Service did not allow a plaque or any memorial at the crash site on Mount Taylor, but they did allow us to bring some rocks down from the crash scene, and that forms the base of this life-size propeller memorial in honor of the victims of TAT's flight. The airplane was the city of San Francisco, and the airline itself had only been in operation for 2 months at that time. We're standing here in the 1953 flight service station. It was established here as a weather and radio communications base for the Civil Aeronautics Authority at that time. This building replaced a smaller building up on Acomita Mesa, which was a very remote site about 15 miles from here. This building was established, and that station was moved down here to Grants when the airport, the new airport here at Grants-Milan, was completed. So the building that we are in underwent major restoration over several years in order to stop the rain from coming into the main building and a lot of other problems that it had. But today it's totally restored with a new roof, new services, new heating and air conditioning, and an ADA ramp on the backside for visitors who require that access. The room that we're in here is a gallery that primarily focuses on Charles Lindbergh. And Lindbergh was a primary driving force in the development of transcontinental air transport. He was brought in by the bankers and industrialists who wanted to establish this airmail route, and his role was that of technical committee chairman. Lindbergh helped to evaluate a variety of aircraft for the airline service, and he was extremely involved in all of the weather instrumentation, the communications equipment, and the whole challenge of tying together servicing bases or fuel stops every 250 miles across New Mexico and basically across the west to Los Angeles. So that's pretty much why we have focused here on Lindbergh, and I hope that's a good rationale for establishing the museum. Lindbergh is underappreciated in the West, but his role here in establishing the transcontinental air route was extremely critical, and we have as many exhibits and relics to tell the story of the creation of the airway here. Charles Lindbergh also was a newlywed when the airline began service in July of 1929. He and his wife, Anne Morrow Lindbergh, were involved in troubleshooting the route. In other words, when the airline service began, they were flying back and forth constantly, checking on how effectively the schedules were working out and looking for any bottlenecks or hindrances to the smooth operation of the plane and train coast-to-coast passenger service. Again, they were looking for airmail contracts, and establishing the first coast-to-coast passenger route was critical to validate the work that they were doing to establish the airway. So they did finally begin service in July of 1929, and after a series of setbacks, primarily the crash of the airliner City of San Francisco on Mount Taylor in September, and then the stock market crash of October 1929, all of these issues served to impede but not halt the airline service. Fortunately, there were airmail contracts to be awarded, and within 2 years, improved navigation systems were in place to supplement the beacon system for night flight. So day or night, the route had been aligned and enhanced for additional safety. That included shifting many of the beacons and to a totally dead straight line, and also creating emergency airfields as a safety measure and also as weather reporting stations. Again, Lindbergh, as a newlywed, had a lot of pressure during the first months of this service. He and his wife, Anne Morrow Lindbergh, were involved in troubleshooting, flying up and down the line, and looking at the issues that might arise. When they were not involved in direct airway activity, they also had become enthused about aerial archaeology, aviation archaeology. And here, during the month of July 1929, Charles and Anne were flying the route and were frequently diverting, or on a slow day they would relocate to some of the archaeological sites in the Four Corners region, particularly Canyon de Chelly and Chaco Canyon, as well as some of the pueblos more easterly towards Santa Fe, Taos, and that part of the state. So Lindbergh did quite a bit of aerial photography in the few days that he and his wife were able to break away from the airline evaluation process. And actually, There was recently an exhibit at the Museum of Indian Arts in Santa Fe, which presented Lindbergh's black and white photographs side by side with color photos by the noted aviation photographer Adriel Heisey. So that exhibit is over, but they actually published a book which can be found on the internet, I'm quite sure. So, but it was Lindbergh played a huge role, and he had the confidence of the public and of the investors, and so that is why we want to focus as much as we can on Charles Lindbergh here in the Southwest, which is an underrepresented bit of information. The real beginnings of our aviation museum program and the enthusiasm of our volunteers came from the Passport in Time project with the U.S. Forest Service in the Mount Taylor Ranger District here. The real focus was, one, the crash site of the Ford Trimotor, City of San Francisco, on Mount Taylor in 1929, and secondly, several other potentially significant crashes that took place on forest lands here in the Ranger District, both towards Mount Taylor and also west out into the Zunies. Passport in Time recruits volunteers from around the country through the website to volunteer for different projects going on in the summer. In this case, the idea was to survey the crash of the Trimotor site and to also evaluate other sites that may have potential historic interest. The Trimotor crash, of course, was the most significant as being the first disaster for the TAT airline, and also being having a local significance with ties, impacts on the logging industry, and which was followed very quickly by the stock market crash in 1929. But the work that we did with the Forest Service survey team and archaeologists as volunteers from around the country was to measure and stake out any sort of relics or remnants of the Ford Trimotor that might still be at this site, some almost, well, more than 60 years later in 2009. And this led to an interest in, more generally, in aviation archaeology, not just the crashes, but the infrastructure and, of course, the aircraft and the people who made things happen, the people who flew these airway routes, such as our own mid-continental airway. Our display case here has some of the measuring tools and report forms and some of the relics that would frequently be found at many of the beacon sites scattered across western New Mexico. As we know, the beacons were spaced every 10 miles, and there were emergency airfields every 50 miles that pilots could seek help at. So we have surveyed a number of forest sites on the forest lands, as well as a few on private lands, both beacon towers and the emergency airfields. A lot of what we find is bulb fragments and there's a head gasket from the generator, a whole variety of mostly broken debris, but it is technically tells a very interesting story as to what happened here and how it was maintained, operated, and manned over decades. The beacons across New Mexico in this area, first established in 1929, operated until the last was decommissioned in 1969, and that was Beacon 61 on Oso Ridge on the Continental Divide here. We're standing now in the Flight Service Station operations room. This was the 24/7 nerve center of the Federal Flight Safety Program here along this airway. This building operated from 1953 to 1973, and for most of that time it was a 24/7 operation. The men who worked here were technicians, weather observers, communications specialists, and of course a station chief. you'll notice that this entire room is lined with acoustical tiles, as is the hallway outside. This was a very lively place on a 24/7 basis. We had the telephones going off. We had microphone radio transmission on several bands. And of course the teletype machines were chattering away at intervals, bringing in new data on regional weather and other possible issues, safety issues that might be involved. One thing the flight service station did was to coordinate rescue activities or searches. And another activity, another role was flight following, by which pilots would check in at intervals and report their position until they were out of the area of operations here of this particular building. This was, the crew originally was located up on McCarty's Mesa at the Alameda Airfield. So they were gratified when this new airport was constructed and this new communication facility was established for them. They were able to come down off the mesa to land of paved roads and restaurants and even a post office. So, but other things that we cover in this room are the different aspects of local aviation over the decades, and that includes both the Alameda and Grants Flight Service crews, the people who have staffed this building, and there are many dozens over the years, especially if you go back to the 30s when Alameda was the operating facility here. We also have exhibits on military activity in the skies over Cibola County, and on the Civil Air Patrol and some of the other private flyers, pilots who got their licenses and became aviators based here at the Grants-Milan Airport. This airport operated, opened in late 1952, and the flight service station was ready to operate in early '53. So this was a major step forward for the community and for the area. We also have information on local airfields, and there may be airfields that we haven't heard about yet, because after World War II there was a great deal of interest, huge interest in aviation. And as I say, we have a wall panel that lists dozens of local people who got their pilot's licenses in the late 40s, early 50s, early 60s. So there's very much aviation interest in those days. And it pretty much tapered off after this facility closed in 1973. This building was abandoned, and little by little local aviators dwindled in many cases. They passed on or they moved on, as the case may be. So we are hoping to re-arouse interest in the aviation history of this corridor, this historic corridor across western New Mexico, and not only the beacon sites, but the airfields themselves, and all of the relics that, if you know where to look, still exist out here along the Continental Divide. Well, in wrapping up, we wanted to emphasize how important it has been for Cibola County Historical Society to play a role, a major role, in saving these structures, preserving the history, and carrying the vision of the Transcontinental Air Service to new generations. And certainly all the routes for the aviation that you see today overhead, those routes were planted along this Mid-Continental Airway, one of the first 3 airways that spanned the country for airmail and then passenger service. So the Historical Society is committed to continuing to enhance the functions and the quality of this museum. We've worked very hard to get to this point, but there is always more to do, more relics to find, and more individuals to be interviewed. There's always more perspective that really helps us to open our eyes and widen the base of history that we are trying to interpret here. Basically, the museum on a normal basis is open on Saturdays from 9 o'clock to 1 o'clock. And there are many opportunities with the Historical Society to join, or at least to volunteer here at the museum, or other functions, other topics that we may be focusing on in the future. But if we have more volunteers who might be willing to learn this history and serve as hosts, that might allow us to stay open more time and communicate the message to many more travelers who come by here on Interstate 40, see the beacon tower and the bright orange roofs, and hopefully they're not in such a hurry that they can't get off the freeway, come back here and check it out. We do offer maps of the compound for self-guided walking tours because, as I say, 6 days of the week it's difficult to have someone out here hosting the museum. But Saturdays from 9 to 1, that's our primary schedule, and we have a range of different backgrounds in the current hosts that we have today. Some are pilots, some are not, some are retired teachers, some are retired equipment operators or engineers and geologists. So everyone has a role to play, everyone can learn and gain for themselves by communicating history to others. That's the whole function, the whole mission of Cibola County Historical Society. So we do hope that you've enjoyed what you have seen and heard here. We'll welcome your visit, and we'll thank you for your time.